Hi, I'm Rob Waddell. I'm in the history department here at University of Rhode Island, and we're here doing another round of speaking with civil rights movement veterans and folks that are involved in Mississippi and in Freedom Summer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let Jim introduce himself, and then we'll just have some conversation about his experiences and go from there.
Oh, Jim Gates. Yeah.
And you were telling me before we started that you were in Mississippi in 1964, 1965.
Right.
So what were you involved in Mississippi?
In '64, I was doing voter registration and community organization in northwestern Mississippi in Panola County, and in 1965 it was more community organization in Natchez.
Okay. So down in the southern, southwest part of the state. I want to hear, as much as we can about, what your experiences were there. But if you could, briefly, just sort of give us a sense of where you were coming from before you found yourself in Mississippi. So where you grew up, what your experiences were, and maybe what your motivation or the impetus was for you to become involved in this kind of thing.
I grew up in White Plains, New York, Elmsford and White Plains, New York, suburbs of New York City. Westchester County was a lot more rural then than it is now. When I was in high school, I was minimally or somewhat aware of what was going on in the movement in the South. I was in high school during the year 60, 63. In my senior year, I became more involved when the people were evicted in Greenwood, and the tent city was set up in Greenwood, Mississippi, and I wound up working with some high school friends raising food and clothing support for that. And it was just, we talked a lot of civil rights. We talked a lot about it. We were very aware of it. But I did not think in terms of going south myself at all. In fall of '63, I entered Wesleyan University as a freshman and was recruited for the summer project in the spring of '64.
So when you say, you were aware and you talked about it, was that amongst your peers? Was it in your family? Was it?
Not so much, well, somewhat in the family, but very much among our high school group. I hadn't thought about this so much. Actually, I had not realized how much talking we had done about that in those years until I came across recently a trove of the letters that my high school friends sent me during my first year in college. And it was really a lot of letters that we wrote. We wrote back and forth. There were these things called letters then. We wrote back and forth. And they're preserved. They don't disappear in electronic space. And really a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion in there of the civil rights movement and monitoring of it and thinking about the issues and thinking about what we could do and what different people were doing.
Do you recall, or was there a singular sort of moment or an incident that it first became something that you were aware of?
I don't know of a particular moment. The part of Westchester County that I grew up in, White Plains, the part of White Plains that I grew up in, although it was very privileged, was probably the most racially integrated community in America. Not economically integrated, but racially integrated. And, I grew up with probably as little race consciousness as it was possible to grow up with in the country. One of the things I had to learn in the movement was race consciousness. It was sort of, rather than learn to erase it, I had to learn it in a different kind of way and become aware of it. What I can distinctly remember is the first person in high school who handed me a SNCC pamphlet from SNCC, and I remember the food and clothing drive very vividly that we worked on, raising food and clothing for Mississippi then.
It's it's interesting because a lot of folks that I've spoken with or that I know their stories of, they often point to college as being the point where they learn some of this stuff. So it's interesting to me that they
No, it was high school. Definitely high school. Definitely high school, which was a far more. When I went to college, Wesleyan had no black students. We had one black student in my class. I think he was from Nigeria. We were, if anything, college was far more isolated and far more protected from the real world then at that point, in 1963, 1964, things changed rather rapidly.
So,
the next
how
few
did,
years.
so how did you go then from, the high school student who's, maybe sort of, who's raising money and trying to send supplies and support in that way? How did you go from that to being someone who was going to actually physically go to Mississippi in 1963?
My original plans for the summer of '64 were very different. I had other plans that fell through. So I had sort of looked at people while we were talking about the summer project and said, oh, great to do, but I can't do that. And then the plans fell through, so I applied. I was rejected after an interview. And I think I was rejected for political reasons having to do with the kind of Yale crowd who were interviewing with Wesleyan people and what they were looking for in terms of political orientation for going south. But then I went through New York connections that I had through family and friends, and I reapplied. The reason I can give for why is, there are lots of different reasons. There are so many different reasons, and some of them are I don't understand yet to this day. The thing that I tell kids mostly nowadays is that we were a generation. To understand our generation, you have to hear, whether you agree with politics or not, Kennedy's inaugural speech. You have to understand the sensibility we grew up with of the obligation we had to our communities. And one of the things I like to say nowadays, and I just came to this realization, I always felt uncomfortable when people have said, thank you for what you did for other people in the movement. I never, ever thought I was doing anything for anyone else. In fact, I say going to Mississippi may have been the most selfish thing I've ever done in my life. But it's just that we were of a generation, of group of people who did not think our self ended at our skin. Our self included our community. And we had a responsibility to that community. And what we were doing when we went south, or at least what I was doing for that sense of self, for myself, for the community that I was part of. And I think most of us felt that way. And it was the same impetus that sent some people into the Peace Corps later, that sent many of us, alas, to Vietnam. That sense that we had this obligation, that what we owed our community was just a natural part of what we assumed about ourselves. I don't think there was anything special about it.
So, so you had you pulled on a few connections to get involved there. So I'm gathering from that your family was pretty supportive of your decision, or is that not the case?
My father was very worried. My parents were divorced. My father was very worried about what I was getting myself into. We were still very much shadowed by McCarthyism. And he told me very specifically, be careful what lists you get your name on. You'll lose jobs. You'll pay for this later on. He was very worried from that point of view. He was not living with my mother at the time, and because we were underage, everyone under 21 had to get a signed release from parents to participate. And I brought the release to my mother, and I said, I want you to sign this, I want to go. And she said, I don't want you to go, but I can't stop you. And I said, of course you can stop me. You can refuse to sign. And she said, no, the way I brought you up, I can't stop you. And that was probably the most powerful thing she ever said to me in her life, really, in all our lives together. And it was powerful. There's this scene in a novel by May Sarton about the McCarthy years, called Faithful to the Wounds, where one character turns to another and says, how do we bring up children in times like these? And the spouse, I forget which one is talking to which, says, we bring them up to resist oppression in whatever form, wherever it occurs. And that's what I grew up with. And I was I read that, actually, when I read that in that novel, I called my mother up and said, thank you.
So, you finished, I gather, your first year at Wesleyan.
Yeah.
And then did you go to Ohio to go
yes,
to training?
Yeah, I went to the training in Oxford, Ohio, where I will be going again next month for another conference. This 50th year silly season. And I trained there for 2 weeks.
Okay. And what month was that in?
That was in June.
That was in June.
Yeah, the middle of June.
And was that was there any point in that you sort of second guessed this plan that you had, or was it
no. In fact, it went the other way for me. While I was there, we were assigned to different projects. While we were assigned, we were looked at and picked out and assigned to different projects of where we would go in the state. And I was assigned to a project to the Vicksburg project. And I did not have any confidence in the Vicksburg project leader. Turned out, in retrospect, I was right. The Vicksburg project was not a particularly successful one. I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was that here I was a punk, white teenage kid who was not comfortable, and who could I go and say that I was not comfortable with him and with working in this project? It was politically, socially, just about ethnically, in every possible way, and not something I could do. By that time, I had become very friendly with one of the SNCC staff workers and talked with him about this. And what I wound up doing then was volunteering within the project. There was, while people were assigned to many projects, Bob Moses for the southwest part of the state was taking only volunteers from within the project for all kinds of political reasons and personal reasons and his involvement. We can get into the whole story of Bob Moses and his involvement with the southwest part of the state of Mississippi. So I volunteered for the Southwest, partly because he was taking volunteers and because it was needed there. And I said, well, in for a penny, in for a pound kind of thing. But also partly for that tactical reason of getting out of the Vicksburg project. Sort of a tactical decision.
So Vicksburg was the first place you went.
I was never.
So you never went.
I never got to Vicksburg until 2003.
Okay.
No, I was assigned to that project, but I immediately opted out as soon as I was uncomfortable with there, and worked with the people who were training for the Southwest. As it turned out, in the summer of 1964, very few of the people who were trained for the Southwest ever got there. Bob kept holding us back, and after the killings of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman particularly, he was very reluctant. For political reasons, we had to send people into the Southwest because the Southwest was the stronghold of the Klan, and the rest of the state was the stronghold of the citizens' councils, which were theoretically more moderate. And if we had not sent volunteers into the Southwest, then the Klan would have had a talking point. We kept him out. So politically, some volunteers had to go into the Southwest, at least in a token fashion. In reality, Bob was very afraid, both for his personal experience and also after what had happened already in what we thought was the easiest part of the state, which was Meridian, where Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman were killed. Very reluctant to send anyone in there. So it became he wound up sending only of all of us who were trained for the Southwest, he sent down there only those of us who had special skills, who could drive cars or could really more mature. I was not one of those people. So I did not get to the Southwest until 1965, okay, which is another story, another part of the story.
So where did you end up the first time you went down?
So I was sent after training, I went briefly to Holly Springs and then to Panola County in the northwest part of the state. Panola County had a special court order. Again, we have to get into here what the whole voting registration process was in Mississippi. It involved a 21-question application form to apply to register to vote. Not to register to vote, to apply to register to vote. 3 of those questions were, in effect, essay questions. And then there was a whole other procedure. In Panola County, there had been a special federal court order that eliminated the essay questions and forced the county clerk's office to stay open more frequently. So there was to see if black people really would come to register to vote if things were made easier. So there was a real push on in Panola County for working the voter registration to try and make that court order show an effect. So I joined the Panola County project there. And I wound up working in Batesville, Mississippi, and then later in the summer in Como, Mississippi, which is a small town in the Northwest that I still feel very close to and still have close attachments to.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what, assuming that you had not been to Mississippi prior to this experience, what those first experiences were like for you when you arrived in Mississippi. Was it unsettling? Was it
One of the things I think that was very different for me about a lot of the other Northern volunteers was that I had, as a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, had read the landmark books. There was a wonderful series of children's history books. And I had glommed onto Robert E. Lee as a particular father figure hero from the time I was 10 or 11 years old. And that had led to an interest in the Confederacy and kind of a passionate kid's involvement without knowing the politics of anything, to sort of the Confederate history and then Civil War history and then American history in general. And of course, this was just leading up to the centennial of the Civil War. So there were a lot of books and a lot of fervor and attention to that. And when I was 11 and 12 years old, I was this tremendous sort of Confederate partisan. By the time I was 15 or 16, with a pretty sophisticated knowledge of Southern and American history. And I think I went south with a very different point of view from a lot of the other Northerners. A lot of my colleagues who sort of said, what's the big deal? We just want to get black people to vote. Of course black people should vote. We're not trying to change anyone's way of life. I think I had a much greater appreciation, simply by accident. I mean, I had other kinds of naivete, but I don't think I had that particular cultural naivete about the South. And I think I really knew more about it, perhaps, and was more prepared in that way than a lot of my colleagues.
So what areas were you naive about?
Politically fairly naive. The infighting and the kind of background politics, as I said, I'd also had to develop a race consciousness that I didn't have. I still think I cultivate that political naivete. I have no nonsense for the infighting of the Trotskyites and the Stalinists and whatever version shows up in any particular movement. And I think I also had to learn about all the subtle. Certainly, I had to learn a new culture. The other thing that I had to learn...
Movement culture you had to learn?
I had to learn two new cultures. Or as I say, I think maybe three. First of all, and I was talking about this in Ohio, when I was in Ohio last spring at the Western College for Women. Something we really began to explore and thinking about was that for many of us volunteers, our first cultural challenge and having to learn was the training time. Not just with facing SNCC staffers and black people and people from rural Mississippi, but for many of us who say came out of an intellectual Jewish background in New York and had gone to elite colleges, suddenly facing preachers' kids from Iowa was already a cultural kind of negotiation that we had to enter into. We had to learn how to live with each other. The political, the sort of hardline red diaper baby type kids coming up again against certain kind of idealistic American tradition, and recognizing that what we had to modify, what we had to learn, what we had to make common cause of, that we didn't have that much in common before. This was even before we start talking about the SNCC staffers and and rural Mississippi. In my case, coming out of this kind of sophisticated, intellectual New York Jewish background, one of the things I had to learn to do is listen and let other people talk and learn how to value other people's experience. That was not something I had been brought up to do. And even in my college, my college was the hard-bitten intellectual, fight back, argue, dialectical kind of conversation. And for me, the greatest jump in the world, and that's probably been most valuable serving me since in my life, has been learning how to shut up and listen to other people. It's not apparent right here now, I'm afraid.
But we're encouraging you to go the other direction.
Yeah, I know. And actually, it's a little hard for me now. It's not easy for me. Once I get started, once I get rolling, I can do it. But it's not easy for me anymore. It was a lesson I learned very deeply.
So when you arrived in Panola County and were there, tell us a little bit about some of the stuff that you were doing just on an everyday basis while you were there.
In theory, what we were doing was going around door to door, going to picnics, stopping on street corners, talking to people, asking them to do one of two things: to register to vote, go down to the courthouse and register to vote, and to sign up in the freedom registration for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And if you know, whether we get into the specifics of what all that meant is a whole thing. And in practice, most of what we did was talking to people and listening to people and just being there. And the fact that we were there became far more powerful than anything we could say or do explicitly. Yes, we arranged mass meetings, and yes, we tried to get people to go places. First of all, we didn't need to argue with people about going to register to vote. We might try to encourage everyone knew what we were there for. There was no, I mean, these are not people who are dumb. They knew exactly who we were and what we were there for. There was the myth of sort of walking up to a step and saying, "Hey, have you heard about voter registration?" It's sort of a white people's construct myth. No. Oh, they may have pronounced our names funny to us, but they know exactly who we were and what we were doing there. And the real thing we were trying to do was get them to overcome the natural reluctance and the natural fear that had been bred in. And to that, we had to model that. And to model that across racial lines, across economic lines, proved to be, by the end of the summer, easier than I think we thought it would be. Certainly harder than some people imagined it might be before they started in an idealistic way. But you go up on someone's doorstep and you talk about the cotton crop. And you're standing on their doorstep. And the fact that you're standing on their doorstep for them, for the local farmer, that he's letting you stand on your doorstep while cars go past, he has already taken a tremendous step right there in bravery. Whether he acknowledges it, well, he does. Most of the time they do. We got chased off a lot of doorsteps. Not because people didn't like us, but because they were afraid and legitimately afraid. So the important thing we were doing there was just being there, was modeling, was walking into people's homes and being a person among other people. Does that make sense?
It does. Were you, was that something you were conscious of at the time, or is that something that you've figured out in the years since?
I mean, tactically, we were conscious of it at the time. One of the things, one of the things that I was fortunate about was that I came from Wesleyan University, not from Harvard, Yale, Stanford, or Columbia. In other words, when I was talking about and introducing myself to people, I didn't sound intimidating. Harvard, Yale, these sort of known elite places, some people were interested and fascinated by them. Wesleyan, every state has a Wesleyan. It identified me wrongly, but as a Methodist, it was identifiable, it was placeable. There was a way where, and I exploited that. I exploited the fact that I knew the Bible, and that I could pull out biblical quotations talking to people. I could make them up even. I mean, with a literature background, I could quote Talmud as if it were Bible, and I did. So tactically, yes. We sort of were aware that I was doing that for this purpose. Whether I thought about it in the deeper sense at the time, no. But you know what? I mean, the other side of it is that with a modicum of human openness, it's what I wanted to do. I wanted to learn about the cotton crop. I wanted to know how things, I mean, once a human interaction starts, it's not tactical. It's personal. And I wound up working very largely with high school kids and working with, partly because we were always supposed to work in pairs. And I was working a small town in the north part of the county where I was, for the most part, officially alone. So I wound up working with a very, very active, wonderful local high school kid who was active as a student movement kind of thing. His son, by the way, is a dean at the University of Rhode Island now. And we may see him later today. I asked Jeff if he was coming. So I was spending a lot of time in and out of the houses. I was one of the younger of the volunteers. I was only, I was a year or two older than these kids. So they were the ones I was most comfortable with in many ways, and hanging out with, and going door to door with, and we had common interests, or we developed.
So you were there from in June of '64 up through August.
End of August '64.
And then you went back to Wesleyan.
No.
So
No, this was actually a personal crisis in my life because I was supposed to go the fall of my sophomore year. I had been slated and scheduled to go for my semester abroad to Paris. So first of all, I mean, all of us volunteers will talk about the difficulty we had leaving Mississippi at all. But for me, it wasn't a choice of going a couple of hundred miles away. For me to leave the state was to go thousands of miles away across an ocean. And I agonized about whether I would go at all or whether I would quit school and go stay in Mississippi. And finally, what I wound up doing is I sat down with two people. One was Jimmy Travis, the SNCC staffer that I had befriended in June, who had become a close friend. And we stayed friends until his death a few years ago. And the other was Jim Foreman, who at the time was the executive secretary, head of SNCC. And Jimmy was saying, very wisely to me, hey, we'll still be here when you get back. Go. And Jim Foreman had been a graduate student in French. And he said, you're going to Paris. So there's a large student community in there in Paris that's completely politically unattached to what's going on here. You could go there and you could really do stuff with that student community for support work. So I wound up going to Paris. I wound up working not only with the Paris student community, but also with the Paris business community, American expat business community, the American church in Paris I worked closely with. We set up tremendous sort of support and awareness things. At the time, I made connections with the USIS, which I'm sure was monitoring my behavior very carefully, but we knew that didn't matter. Working with their library, the head of the USIS had recently come from being stationed in Africa, and so had his assistant, who was a very dynamic young black woman. She introduced me to the African student community in Paris, whom I never would have met otherwise. And I wound up spending a lot of time with them. So the semester turned out again to be a tremendous opening support situation for me and providing some support and help for the movement. In terms of the awareness, in terms of raising money and getting things going, giving talks, explanations. What I had not counted on, but in retrospect is an interesting cultural thing, is the Germans have this kind of cultural fascination with American Indian culture, Native American culture. The French have this weird infatuation, not weird, but strange, with American black culture, and always have had. And so not just the American community and the African community, but the French sort of picked me up when I was there as being a representative. So I wound up doing things in French. So it became a very productive semester, actually, and not away from the movement, but having brought the movement with me.
And then
went back to Wesleyan.
In the spring, and then in '65 you went to the Southwest finally?
Yeah, well, in 1965, I was active, that was the time of Selma, and I was very active during the spring in Washington, D.C., doing support work for SNCC. And then at the beginning of the summer, I went back to I went to Jackson, arrived in Jackson in time for a major demonstration in Jackson. I spent 8 days in jail situation in the fairgrounds in the city jail in Jackson. And then I was planning on going back up to Panola where I had been in '64. But I bumped into, in Jackson, Dory Ladner, who was heading up the Natchez project. And she said, Jim, you've been trained for the Southwest. We need you there. So I didn't go back to Panola. I went to Natchez in '65 instead of going back to the Northwest.
And was that a very different experience?
Very different. That was urban. First of all, '65 was not '64. It was an urban kind of experience. A lot of, within the movement, political jockeying and complications within the Natchez movement, and then of course within SNCC at the same time. It was a fascinating time. My brother-in-law and one of his colleagues came down and made a film in Natchez about that summer, Black Natchez, a documentary film, which catches very well all of the complications of what were going on, and certainly. And I actually had to leave. I was made a target for the Klan at one point, and with one of the people I was working with, because we were organizing steam laundry workers, and we left early so that we wouldn't especially draw the wrath of the Klan on us on the project. So I left there before the end of August.
So you found yourself, mentioning you found yourself not just doing voter registration work, but doing, labor organizing.
Yeah. Oh, it was very fun. In Natchez, it became like these stories we had read from the 1930s of, standing on street corners and getting people as they come off work, who wouldn't want to compromise their names, and sort of, clandestine meetings, and it was like these labor stories from the teens and the 30s of organizing. Yeah, it was, and then the steam laundry conditions were terrible. But that was also when we started. See, what happened toward the end of 1964, the summer of 1964, and in 1965 was again the radicalizing. You think you're doing voter registration, but then you realize, wait a minute, this is one issue here, this is one issue there. These are all connected. These are all involvement. Okay, voter registration in rural Mississippi means getting involved with the agricultural stabilization and conservation people. That's where the real power is in a rural county. Who's going to be on those? Who's running those? In a city, you're starting to deal with unions, you're starting to deal with hospital workers, and hospital access was a big thing that we were concerned about, especially for mothers in Natchez. And so what happens in the movement is that we became more and more sensitive to the range of actual movements that people are involved in, far beyond our own experience, far beyond, it really is, it's subversive.
One of the things I'm interested in as a historian is how those everyday issues that people are facing sort of in their daily lives become the impetus for political action,
Yep.
And the like. And so,
well, that's essentially what community organizing is about. That's the nature of community.
Right.
The nature of community organizing is to listen to people, find out what are the issues that matter to them, and help them turn those into political action. That's exactly what it's about. So that you're sitting there, again, listening, learning, far more. And what we had were the organizing skills, perhaps, but even that. Story from 1964, an anecdote. We're organizing for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party precinct meetings. And I was working then and still in Batesville, wasn't in Como yet, with Jeff Cowan, slightly older Harvard graduate student. And we're in charge of getting one precinct meeting going. So we go to the first precinct meeting. Help get people set up, people sit around. Fine. Next meeting time is set up. I'm sitting in the Freedom House with Jeff. I said, Jeff, we're going to be late. Meeting's going to start. And Jeff, who is much smarter and wiser than I, said, yep, we're going to be late. So we arrived 45 minutes late, even by Mississippi standards. If you're a Southerner, you know what that means. And we found the meeting was in full swing without us. We didn't go to the third meeting. That's successful organizing. That's what successful organizing is about. It's not about running things. It's about sparking things. And that's what we learned.
Yeah. And you learned that, in Mississippi.
I learned that in Mississippi. I learned that. I still to this day thank Jeff for that particular. That's the specifics of it. I've learned it generally in other things, but specifically it's sort of a model.
So you had to leave in '65. You became a target.
Mitch Gerfield and I were organizing the laundry workers, and we had a clandestine meeting with the laundry workers at the Freedom House. And we had, of course, promised as much anonymity as possible. And all of a sudden, we're walking along the street one evening thereafter, and police pick us up, haul us off, take us down to the police station. As I say, for me, the great relief was when the police car turned downtown instead of out of town. And we were booked on charges of assaulting two 10 or 11-year-old kids in a public park in Natchez with knives. And we were supposed to have done this at precisely the same time that we were holding our meeting. It happened to be that one of those kids was the son of one of the Klan leaders in Natchez. And it seemed very clear to us that the whole purpose of this was to force us to name the laundry workers.
I was going to ask, so to give an alibi.
Yes. In other words, which, that was the purpose of this. It was such an absurd thing on the face of it. We recognized that. We sort of saw that. But it would have forced us to out these, to use a word that was not used then, to out the laundry workers and name, and which would have compromised the whole, and would have destroyed all our credibility. So, of course, we talked about it at a staff meeting of what we're going to do for strategy. And the staff sort of agreed that if necessary, we'd just commit mass perjury and say we were having a staff meeting. Most of the staff people were hanging around the Freedom House anyway at the same time. And what happened was we got into the courtroom, and the judge for Natchez, who was, by the way, up for election, was a very courageous judge. And he listened to the prosecution, the kids give their talk about our getting in a white station wagon and going into the park and chasing them around with knives. And he dismissed the case. He said, there's no case here, without getting a defense, it was one of three cases that came up that day. The next guy was a black teenager accused of mouthing off to a police officer, and he got convicted of coming after us. The judge had to come down hard on him because but it was an incredibly courageous thing that he did just by throwing the kid. The courtroom was lined with Klansmen, armed, sitting in the front rows. And we were dismissed. And we sort of had a kind of party that night, but the lawyer who was with us said, maybe you two should get out of town. Probably a good idea if you don't stick around. You will now be a target, and the project will be a target before. And there had been bombings before, and there's a bombing afterwards. We're not talking about someone throwing a rock through a window. And my one regret is that I let the lawyer talk me into leaving the state. I realized I could have gone up for the next couple of weeks back to Panola County. And in retrospect, why didn't I? Why did I make him sort of run me out of the state? But it's probably the only regret I have about my time in Mississippi is that I didn't go back to Panola County after that.
So then back to college.
Back to college, active doing stuff in the North. Then, of course, support work in the North, and then even in 1964, the news broadcast that announced the finding of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman's bodies was the same news broadcast in which Johnson announced the Gulf of Tonkin. And I remember turning to the people I was with in Como, or we're watching it on the television, and saying, this means there's a war on, and we won't be able to do what we want to do. This is going to derail us until we stop this war. I was apparent to those that again, there was a seamless connection. It wasn't being anti-war necessarily because it was anti-war about Vietnam yet, or any kind of thing about those politics, but that this was going to prevent us from doing what we were already engaged in doing. It was and that was the bridge into the anti-war movement for, I think, a lot of us, certainly for me. Even before, I mean, it was also became then the bridge into from tactical nonviolence to philosophical nonviolence was also going on at the same time. You know, all kinds of things came together, but there was not sort of one movement and then another. They were clearly connected.
So that became sort of the...
So I wound up, well, working mostly in the White North, the anti-war organizing became my, you know, the focus of my activist experience. What I had learned became put to use there, along with the rest of my life.
And so you graduated?
No, I never graduated. I finished Wesleyan, I finished the education, I finished the college, but I never graduated. Didn't finish all the work. I did go on, actually, it's another long story. I went on and did a year of graduate work at the University of Rochester, where I worked again downtown in the Rochester community while I was there, and that's where I got heavily involved
when the rebellion happened in Rochester, or was that?
Which rebellion are you talking about?
the one that is more widely known. I'm trying to remember. That was in '67.
I was there in '67, '68.
Okay.
I was there in '67, '68.
I may be wrong. I'm only a historian.
Yeah, no, I was not. No, there was not there for an uprising kind of thing. We were there for Rochester. Actually, it's a whole other story about the movement, and you might be interested in this too. Rochester was a company town, which meant that for those of us who sort of were raised in the sudden realization of the interactions, of the connections of the white power structure, things were nakedly clear and on the surface. That the people who ran the university were the same people who ran the corporations, were the same people who ran the city. And it led us into some fascinating politics beyond the civil rights movement when we staged a sit-in against Dow recruitment in the fall of '67. Fall of '67 on the university campus. Those of us who were graduate students were suspended, and the entire student body, I just recently found a document about this, went out on strike to protest our suspension. There was millions of dollars of construction going on the U of R campus. The union working on construction said, if we see one university professor on the picket line, we will regard the AAUP as a craft union, and we will not cross that line. This you would not have found in a lot of cities at this time. But you see, but this is where I say the nakedness of what a white power structure was so apparent in Rochester. And we could have other stories like that too. It was a fascinating place to be a movement organizer that year. And of course, the university caved the minute they didn't care about us, but the minute the construction might come to a halt, they caved.
So you were that. So I know
we're a long way from the starting. Yeah, well, we're a long way from the starting point here, but not in terms of my life, but in terms of the important things.
And you know, I'd love to. We could sit and chat all day. But
you're around. We can.
Yes. But but for for here on the tape, can you is it even possible to give sort of an idea of how your experience in Mississippi then informed where you went, in the next, 50 years?
Well, clearly it changed my life. I mean, clearly I became philosophically nonviolent. I became a nonviolence trainer. even in personal life, the lessons I learned about how to behave have affected me. It's affected me as a teacher, affected me as a writer. The one thing I will not over-romanticize, though, is people said, "Oh, that summer changed my life." Well, yeah, just about anything you do the summer you're 19 is going to change your life. I mean, that's a perspective to keep too. That if you're at all open to the world and you're 19 years old, what you do that summer is going to be something that's going to affect the rest of your life. The question is how, specifically, in what ways. In my case, those summers in Mississippi did help make me the person I am. And there's no simpler or more complex way to put it, except by sort of looking at my life.
And who is that?
Well, that we can't sum up. Yeah.
So you've been teaching.
I've been a teacher, a nonviolence trainer, as the activist part of me, a writer, a publisher, and a literary translator. Mostly involved, been going back to the South, going back to Mississippi for the last 30 years, pretty regularly, at least once a year. Grown back again closer to the communities that I worked in Panola County, in a very rich and moving way for me, where they now consider me part of their community. And I've learned so many of the backstories from the white community that I can sort of rewrite and retell the whole story of the summer of 1964 in a far fuller and richer way than even as we lived it. Because even this last June, when I was there, a few of us were back and we were talking at a Rotary Club. And one of the white people my age, he'd been a teenager in the 60s, said, he said, when you guys were here in 64, he said, my father had a small little business reconditioning football helmets. So it was an independent business, which is sort of an important back part of the backstory. And, there's a white guy talking. He said, you guys were doing stuff to something down in the courtroom square with the voter registration. My father piled us into the pickup truck, the kids into the pickup truck, drove us down to the square in Batesville and said, you watch this. This is history happening. These are the stories we don't hear in the sort of mythic simplifications. And the one thing that I've sort of given myself over to more recently is getting behind and away from the myths of the movement and more into the actual realities and the kinky realities and the complications that made up what we were doing and that we were part of, that for me are far richer and more interesting than you find, for instance, I will not use the word freedom summer. I will not, pigeonholes are for pigeons. I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid of making a stance out of anything. We did things on a day-by-day basis. You said you're interested in, and that's what it was. And other people were doing things, and our lives crossed. And we made something out of that, and that's still being made. It still keeps going on. And that's why I can't say, where do you wrap this up? There is no wrap up, not for me.
So because we don't have a whole lot of time, what I've sort of closed with everybody, it's an artificial way of closing things up, right? Because we could talk and talk and talk.
This is Actor Studio. Do I get?
What's your favorite curse word?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Because part of what we're trying to record here today is not just sort of capturing that history, but also something for young folks that are
That's what I work with. Actually, that's most important for me too.
And so if you could speak to what you see as opportunities or ways or paths that young people in today's world might be able to follow, that might be able to learn something from your experience, or
well, no, the thing that people to learn from our experience is that what you call history is not made by special people under special circumstances. It's made by everyday people under ordinary, everyday circumstances, everybody doing their bit and their part. I remember once giving a talk in New York to retired Teamsters. And I was talking to them about the role the Teamsters Union played in bringing supplies to Mississippi when other cars were stopped, but the Teamsters Union was too powerful to be stopped, and how important that was for bringing stuff in. And talking afterwards about their experience. And one of the retired Teamsters said, you know, when Corps shut down New York City at the World's Fair in 1964, he said, I was the one who raised the drawbridge on whatever, the North River or whatever it was. He said, yeah, that's what movements are. That's what makes things happen. And the argument is not for young people, it's for the older people in a way, because we're not making the opportunities for kids. I gave a talk at Southern Methodist University, and this is again one of the anecdotes when it was in 2007 or so, before Obama, which is important to think about. Not 2004, 2007, about 2007. And Southern Methodist University, very white, very privileged, Dallas. And we're talking about, and one of the kids sitting in bleachers there, saying, was asked me, he said, well, you know, what's sort of different about this, you know, and I sort of threw back at them, what's different? And one of the girls, sort of blonde girl, lounging in a chair like this, sitting in the back, said, well, you know, we don't act because we don't think anyone will listen to us. We don't think it makes any difference. We don't think anyone, you know, we don't think we can have an effect. And I looked up at her and I said, do you mean to say, I was down below, do you mean to say that if someone came along and said to you that what you did made a difference and that you really could have an effect, that you would act? And this girl sat up straight and her back went straight and this big smile came on her face and she said, yes. Failure isn't the kids, it's ours. I mean, the Obama, which could have been a movement and instead was an election and a campaign, was a chance. But they're waiting. The kids, there's nothing we have to preach to them. They're waiting. Oh, that's my preaching.
Well, I want to say thank you for sitting down with us, and you and I, unfortunately for the folks that are watching, they won't be able to, but you and I will sit down and
well, we can plenty of time. Yeah, we can. Yeah.